Welcome to another episode of Coming to Your Senses, where we talk about navigating the labyrinth of the mind and emerging victorious. So thank you for joining our conversation. And today I am joined by yoga philosopher, teacher and friend. I didn't quite know how I was going to introduce you. James Boag. So welcome, James.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Jules. I'm very pleased to be here. And I think Coming to Your Senses is such a great title, so I'm excited to see where the conversation goes.
Well, let's launch in with the first question then, because coming to your senses is the point of that first question, which is, can you share a time in your life where you came to your senses and where and what that led you to?
Wow. It feels like there's a rush in of 8 different, maybe more different possibilities. Because, I mean, you mentioned, so I share teachings on yoga. And, I often say yoga begins when we recognize, own, acknowledge, oh, I'm not in a state of yoga, meaning I'm not in the most balanced, cohesive, integrated state I could be. So it's like I come to the recognition, oh, I'm not as integrated as I could be. My life doesn't feel quite as easeful as I'd like it to. And maybe I've got quite a lot to do with that, and I could do something about it. And in that context, I mean, as I mentioned, there's several things were kind of flooding in. I think one thing I would mention is as a fairly young child, I'm in England at the moment where I grew up, and I remember it's a nice summer's day. So when I was 35 years ago, on a day like this, I would have been wanting to be outside. It's the summertime playing tennis, for example. And I remember as an 11-year-old boy, sometimes on a weekend, me and my school friends would just go up to the tennis courts. They were all open back in those days. You didn't have to pay anything. And we would just play tennis all day in the summer. And now and again, it didn't happen that often, but now and again, I would just get into this state where there was nothing else. And I was just totally absorbed in the game. And this happened with football and basketball. Basketball quite a lot in my late teens when I was really doing that a lot. But I just got so high. And it was like a transcendent experience. Later, as I learned more about yoga, there was all sorts of terms for this type of experience, including yoga. But I didn't recognize it in those linguistic terms then, but it did feel amazing. And it made me think, or it kind of a sense or a prescience that there's more than all of this. There is this subtler aspect of reality. There is a spiritual dimension, if you like, or there is a dimension beyond the mundane. And if I apprentice myself to reality, maybe I can get greater access to that realm of wonder and expansion and find an anchor amidst all of the whirling chaos of life. And when like as a teenager, feeling all this angst, sports was this kind of refuge for me because it allowed me to export, I think that's the root of the word sport, to export myself from my angst. But then as time went by and I started to get into yoga, to realize it's not really about exporting myself from my angst. It's actually giving myself a set of tools and principles to be in the angst and not be sunk by it, but to recognize this is a wave. And waves are going to come in life. So I might as well learn to be a swimmer and a surfer, and maybe even a sailor. Let's try and get equipped as best you can. And so I think those early experiences with sports and the transcendent were really significant. And then
did you recognize them as transcendent moments? How would that 11-year-old James have spoken about them?
I don't know if I would have spoken about them with anybody, but in my own, because I don't know if I would have felt that it would have gone down very well or been accepted or appreciated. But I remember very vividly just having this sense of, like, I know I'm higher than all of these people who are taking all these drugs when I have this experience. So it felt like I'm high, but I'm high on it, on life, on for it, just on the breath of life, on spirit. I didn't have these words for it, but I felt this feels right. And I had this sense of this is, so when I was maybe I should mention another part of the context is, so when I was a child, I used to go to church. When I was born in the market town of Beverley in East Yorkshire, and my next door neighbours, we moved when I was 7. In those first 7 years, they were a Christian family and wonderful people. They lived the teachings. And David Simon, he's now dead, but he gave me some amazing teachings in my early childhood in a very invitational way. There was no kind of forcing, no dogmatic. It was just about how are you showing up in the world? And these people showed up so beautifully. They were so helpful to my parents. This man taught my dad all sorts of things that my dad had never been exposed to before, in terms of like how to do all the household work, paint and decorate and all that stuff. So they really lived with generosity of spirit. But when I went to Sunday school, and back in those days, maybe it was the same for you, Jules. We're of a similar type of generation. We also learned a bit about Christianity at school, but some of these teachings that I heard, it just got me thinking. And I remember being in the bath when I was 7 years old and thinking, God is in the soap. God is in the water. God is everywhere. This is God. This is everywhere. And so this was my sense of God, or the transcendent. It's something that is in everything. And so, but it wasn't that life always felt like that. Sometimes I was bored or frustrated or whatever, or the teachers are telling us you have to do this and it's a load of rubbish or whatever. I was having all sorts of, and the trials of life, whatever. But I just remember sometimes when I was playing sports, I had the sense of this is, I'm moving in the direction of reminding, being able to have the experience of that which is beyond my egoic concerns. But I didn't have this terminology for it at that age at all. But it just felt so relieving and uplifting and inspiring. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, Jules, but
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that what I'm loving about that is that it's phenomenal, isn't it, when those little seeds are planted by not always a family member, sometimes a family member, but neighbors, teachers, well-meaning big people around us, that especially when it's not in that doctrine way, but in that invitational way, or how about this, or look at this, or that experimentation, exploring way, and what that can lead us to. I'm as you were talking, I'm like, I can't really think of any time in my life where I had that level of invitation. It was mostly a doctrine that came toward me from any description, whether it was about how to be as a human being, you must say please and thank you, or and got very much into trouble if I didn't do those things. But it was really interesting that as a 7-year-old, it was very much a bad thing and really told off. So it wasn't it was a do as I do, or do as I tell you to do, rather than an invitation to explore, well, what could that be like and what's it like if you don't? And I think that I really love that you had that influence in your life, and that you can remember as a 7-year-old seeing or experiencing, or even if it was just intellectually labeling God as in the bubbles and God as in the water, that's still an exploration of knowing. And knowing you as I do now, to me, every time I have a conversation with you, more pieces of the puzzle fall in, and I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense. That makes sense how that connects to that. And I love that about having conversations with people. But what I find fascinating is that you were experiencing that high in sport, and it wasn't, even though you'd had the influence of the Christian family next door, it wasn't that led you into Christianity. It was that experience of transcendence, even though you, as you say, you wouldn't have labeled it that way as a child, but you knew that there was something more within the game that you were playing. And even if you didn't have the word, and there's two things really I'm intrigued about is one, how did you know that it would have been inappropriate, uncomfortable, not received well to have spoken about that either with your peers or anyone else? And two, did you connect the God is in the bubbles to that transcendent sport moment?
Yeah, so that the first thing about how did I know? I guess, so we moved house when I was 7, and so when we moved, I then started the junior school, having been at the infant school. And, I was fortunate. I had lots of nice school friends, good teachers. It was a nice environment. But at the same time, I was already becoming aware that I had certain sensibilities or sensitivities that were a little bit different. And it was just best not to mention those things, because they would make me a target, let's say. So I was just aware of that because at school, the type of school environment I grew up in, one had to be very careful about being different. And sports was also kind of a great. It was really helpful for me because I playing sports had a lot of older friends who were quite big and tough, who liked me. And I had a lot of young. So sports meant I had a big age range of friends, not just the kids in my year at school, but I played with older kids, and some of them would look out for me, and it gave me a lot of protection. But I also noticed that some kids were always looking for a target. So I was conscious that anything that was to do with things that were a bit out there, those were easy targets. Just don't mention those things in these contexts, As I got older, I think many of my friends, they recognized there was something a bit different in me, but they didn't mind it. It's like, okay, you can. And I would also say, I'm conscious as well, like the family context I grew up in, there was a lot of mixed messaging from different, like, for example, like you're talking about manners. I remember being told by different family members at the same family gathering, if you don't ask, you don't get. And wait till you're offered. So there I am, and one of my aunts is like, "What's the matter with you?" I said, "Oh, I'd really like to have one of those, whatever it was, on the Boxing Day buffet or whatever it was." And she's like, "Well, if you don't ask, you don't get." But I'm like, "Well, yeah, but I've just been told I mustn't." It was so confusing. And I think, so it kind of made me realize, I think, okay, I need to tread carefully and just keep my eyes and ears open. And I recognize that different people had different cultures, let's say, even within the same culture. And so I was, from an early age, I guess I became aware of a certain cultural sensitivity was helpful. And this was probably amplified when I went from age 11, I used to go and stay with a French family in the summer holidays. And that was, again, another culture. And it was a family with 5 boys. So just a different environment to the one I grew up in at home. And again, what do you display? What do you share? Just learning to be a little bit, to read the cultural context, I guess. But it certainly didn't feel, it wouldn't have felt like it was a sensible, safe thing to do at the junior school, to start talking about, oh man, I had an experience of God when I was seeing the sun come through the trees on the football pitch, kind of thing.
Sir, I think there's something wrong with James. I think he's broken.
Yeah. So, and then, sorry, what was the second question, Jules?
I don't know. I've completely forgotten now as well. It's so engaged with that story. I'm just picturing this 11-year-old boy who's having these intense experiences, really, and then but not being able to share them with anybody and navigating that world. And I absolutely get. I was told by the same family member, "I want doesn't always get, but if you don't ask, you don't get." And I'm like, I don't understand. They're completely opposite and confusing. And I don't think it's uncommon for that kind of mixed messaging to be received by a mind that is desperately trying to navigate who they are and how everything works. No idea what my second question was. Now I'd have to go back and rewind and check and see. But it's interesting because what you mentioned earlier the phrase that you used that really captured my attention was as there was something about anchoring in a whirling chaos, finding an anchor in a whirling chaos of life.
Yeah.
And the reason I wrote it down is because that is exactly what the brief was that I gave to people for the guys who created the logo for Coming to Your Senses. Because that to me is exactly what it is that in the center, we have those moments where we come to our senses, and outside all around us can be this whirling chaos of life. And how I was imagining it is that an 11-year-old boy was stood on, whether it was the football pitch or the basketball court or wherever it may be, and having that transcendent moment and the game kind of playing around him, but him being absolutely cool with that and being with the game as well as being outside of the game. That was my interpretation of what you were saying anyway.
Well, I think what I experienced as a child and as a teenager was I just felt I could get access to this just feeling great when I was playing sports, and when I would get absorbed in it. And I understand there's many factors that would play into that. One is the neurochemical realities. You're moving, you're exercising, you're stimulating all these hormones, and I had a predilection for that. But the other thing that I recognize, and from the yogic perspective, is like yoga means bringing together, joining, gathering, integrating. So when I was playing sports and I was really absorbed in it, I'm using my sensory faculties, I'm using my mental faculties, I'm emotionally engaged, like all parts of myself are engaged in common cause. And so I've joined myself up. So when I feel fragmented or torn or split or spread thin, I don't feel great. So for example, when I was 15, I had a crush on a girl in the year below at school. She wasn't interested in me. I was a bit down about it. Then there was a basketball match, and then it was done. Because in the match, like, gave me a different focus. I was totally into it. And then it allowed me to transcend that feeling of being down in the dumps. But what I recognized was happening with this, the sports or the training or the discipline of practice and all these things, they were giving me a place to, at the time, I thought it was to just to leave behind my troubles. But what I realized was actually happening was I was tuning in to a part of myself that was always there. But sports was the avenue or the vehicle to get into it initially. But I also experienced it in some other ways. And then I remember in my early 20s when I got into yoga, I realized, because for example, like the getting into the zone, like playing basketball and getting into that state of transcendence, that would happen not very often. I had no control over it. And sometimes when I would play and I wouldn't feel like that, and it would be frustrating, and some days everything you're seeing, like, the basketball hoop is massive, you can anticipate where the ball's going to be, everything's flowing and you feel great. Other days, no. And when it all comes together, it's amazing, but it doesn't always come together. And then when I started to get into yoga, I realized, I can get myself together without the need for having a group of other people who want to play this game in the same way as I do, and my physical reality being lined up in a certain way. And then I started to explore yoga practices and realize, that place, that state, isn't dependent on particular external factors. It's an emergent property of my own awareness as a conscious, sentient being. And if I harness and work with the gifts of a human incarnation, I can gain more consistent, steady access to that, and then be anchored in the deathless part of myself. And to me, that was the massive transformation that came when I was, let's say, initiated into the realm of yoga, because I realized, the place that is safe, the place that nobody can touch, is real. And we always have access to it. And now I have tools to be able to remember that and tune into it much more, in a much more, let's say, reliable way. And so find that anchor. So not to deny the trials, tribulations, and whirling wonder of life, but to recognize there is a center point. And I can practice tuning into it, because it's not a fixed point. life's a dynamic process, but if I keep practicing, I can understand that there's a part of me that does have access to a certain steadiness and a certain calm. And life will be challenging. That's inevitable. Sometimes life will be really difficult. But there are resources and supports that are always available. So when the teachings and practices of yoga came into my life, I think I'd been primed for them, let's say, by my experiences of absorption or deep engagement through sports. And then I also got high, sometimes dancing or singing. Any activity that you just totally get into it and you're feeling so good. It's like, well, what is that? And then I realized that's an emergent property of wholehearted, total engagement for something you care about. And wouldn't it be great to live like that? And to me, yoga is about how we can do that in a sustainable and deepening way.
I love so much of what you've said, and I've actually I had plans the weekend that has just gone, and through no rhyme or reason, they all got cancelled for various different things, which left me with a completely open weekend.
Wow.
Which is a rarity these days. And what I noticed when all the cancellations started coming in was how quick my thinking went into, well, I could do this and I need to get that done and I could get this done and I could get that done and da 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 da. And aside from walking the dog, I'm like, do you know what? I'm not making any plans. I know all the stuff that needs to get done, but I am literally going to go moment by moment, like you were talking about. What do I feel completely in alignment with right now that I want to put the energy into? What am I being called to do? And especially yesterday, it was just such a unexpected, beautiful pleasure. I suddenly had the urge to go and create some art. So I was like, right, let's go do that then, which was not on the cards because the shed needed sorting. But, that's what I wanted to do. And when I'd reached a point of going, I'm done with that now. Right. Okay. And none of the projects, I started 4 projects, none of them are finished. And that's absolutely cool. It's like, right, where am I being drawn to next? Oh, right, now I want to go and sort the shed out. Okay, let's go. And it was just such a beautiful thing to follow that. But so many of us don't do that on the day to day. And what I think it would be really important in this conversation is for you to clarify yoga, which I know is very big thing for me to ask you to do in a short space of time. But I think that you and I both know that in most of the Western world, yoga has become a sport. It's become about how you look. It's become a way of, to some degree, some competition. And I just want to clarify for those watching and listening to this, that when you talk about yoga, there's more to it than that. And I'd love to offer that out as a point of conversation. You start for 10, off you go.
Thank you very much, Jules. You've laid down a challenge there because, you suggest yoga. Sometimes I talk about yoga is a 4-letter word. And like many 4-letter words, it gets used casually in ways that distance us from its true power. So there are many words like this, like, for example, icon. People talk about icons in lots of casual ways. But an icon, if we go back to the root of the meaning, it means that which actually helps us connect to the divine or to the transcendent. So it's a symbol pointing to something that's beyond all symbols. It's a way of representing that which is beyond representation. We just talk about, so-and-so is a fashion icon. And it's just, well, okay, but it's not, we're kind of losing a little bit of the mystery of what the language is pointing towards. Anyway, yoga, it means joining, it means connecting. So then comes a question, well, what am I joining? What am I connecting? So ultimately, is the idea, yoga is the practical means to connect my individual consciousness to the consciousness that contains and holds everything. So in other words, yoga means becoming one with everything. Yoga is from the Indic tradition, the tradition of the lands that are now sometimes referred to as India, but which has a culture that is going back many, many centuries before the Abrahamic religions, for example, or certainly before Christianity and Islam. People sometimes talk about Hinduism, but that's also a little bit misleading because that name was only given by the British. The spiritual traditions, the religious traditions, traditions of folklore in the realms that are now called India go back for many, many millennia. And in the traditions of those lands, they don't have so much philosophy as we have in Greece. They had these things called darshanas, which means perspective or way of seeing. And yoga is a way of seeing life, a way of interacting with life. And yoga is the practical school amidst all these different perspectives, or these, we could say, schools of philosophy that's more or less equivalent. But yoga being practical, it's the practical means to live well. So in the Indian tradition, is that when you're a human being, there is a purpose for life. You want to live well, leave things better than you found them, and become freer and freer of your limiting conditionings. So you can actually recognize the essence of who you are, that deathless essence. There's the idea that ultimately everything is one. Everything exists within a field of consciousness. And all of this miraculous manifest existence is consciousness expressing its infinite creative capacity. And each of us is imbued with consciousness. So ultimately, we can only be having an experience because we are consciousness itself. But we forget that. And we get identified with change and limitation. So where do we come from? We all come from the same place. We all come from the womb. And how was it in there? It's like the archetypal comfort zone. But when we come out, we are initiated into the realm of duality. So in the womb, it's just all we ever known. It's just one. We come out into the breathing world. And as our senses start to develop, with these two eyes as a human being, there's always more that we cannot see than we can. Before we get to even, 1 or 2 years old, we start to identify, oh, I'm here and I'm not there. I'm this and I'm not that. I can tap the wall behind me. That is something other than me. I'm here, I'm not there. And consequently, we get identified with change and limitation. We get identified with this bodily vehicle that is made of the changing stuff of nature. Everything in life, in nature, we are nature, nature that which is born, which will die, and in between those two great changes will keep changing. So because we're nature, and because we identify with the body, we start to feel a bit insecure. And in order to bolster our sense of self, we start to develop an ego that isn't really that well thought out. We start to identify with our preferences. I like this, I don't like that. I'm this, I'm not that. To give us a sense of comfort. But it's all delusional. It's just not real. These are just ideas, and they're subject to change. And if we cling to them, sooner or later, they'll cause us to suffer. But the biggest thing we cling to is the known and the familiar, because we have this fear of death, because we're identified with the body. And yoga says, let's escape that trap. Here, as a living, pulsating being, if we work with reality, then perhaps we can fathom its depths and recognize the part of ourselves that never dies. Now, if I'm going to do that, in other words, if I'm going to get connected more reliably with the part of myself that's beyond all the coming and going, it's beyond the body, beyond the mind, beyond my ideas about who I am and what I'm good or bad at, or what's right and what's wrong. If I'm going to get joined to that part of myself, how am I going to do that? Well, that's a great question. I've got a problem there because, first of all, I don't know what that is, this ultimate consciousness. What's that about? I have no idea. But before I get to that, I've got a more immediate problem. I don't know myself. Who am I really? I don't know if you've had this experience, Jules, but I imagine that you and probably most people who are listening have. I've asked people this many times for 20 years now. Have you had the experience, you go to bed thinking, tomorrow I'm going to do that. I'm going to be all about task A. But then on waking, the person who only last night was so resolved about doing task A feels, oh no, I'm not in the mood for A today. I'd rather do B, C, D. Or we feel pulled in different directions. So I recognize I don't know myself that well. Sometimes I feel like different day to day. What's going on? Who am I? And so yoga, being practical, says, well, if we want to get joined up, let's just start where we are. So let's join up all our different constituent parts. All our different constituent parts. That's so many things to join up. But don't worry, yoga gives us a very practical map. First of all, one thing to be aware of is let's just pause for a moment and recognize we are miraculous beings. We have an earthy part, a watery part. We have an internal combustion engine and a digestive fire. We have air and we have space, all inside this body. Now, if I go to the beach and I scoop up some salty water, it's got a bit of sand in on the seashore, and I hold up the glass, it looks like clear water for the first few seconds, but before long, all the silty sand starts coalescing to the bottom, and the earth and the water starts to separate. Similarly, if I put water on top of fire, maybe I extinguish the fire. If I put fire underneath water, maybe the water all evaporates. But in this bodily vehicle, earth, water, fire, air, and space, these elements that don't always cohere so readily, they're all collaborating in this incredible, miraculous homeostasis. So our bodies, our incarnate reality, is the living, pulsating proof that we have an extraordinary capacity to reconcile and harmonize things that might seem impossible to reconcile and harmonize. Still, so all our internal organs, generally speaking, they're doing a really good job of collaborating. But what about our different sense powers? Maybe you've had the experience, you listen, you're hearing something and it just pulls your attention in one direction. Then you see something, it pulls your attention somewhere else. So yoga says, we are like a gang. We are a group of different powers. If we think of our bodily vehicle as a territory or a realm, and each of us is the sovereign of that realm, we have powerful entities living in our kingdom or queendom, including, for example, our sense powers of hearing, of touch, of sight, of taste and smell, including our action capacities of speech and expression, our manual capacities, our movement capacities, our digestive assimilative powers, our creative capacity. We've got all these amazing capacities. And yoga says, let's bring them all into togetherness. So rather than doing things in a partial way, let me train myself in the ways of doing things in the most cohesive way possible. So all yoga techniques, including the very, let's say, more familiar ones of yoga asana or breathing practices or meditation, these are all mechanisms to invite all our powers of sense, of reflection, of active engagement to cohere and gather. And when we cohere and gather around a point of focus, then we can experience something that's greater than the sum of the parts. And when we experience that, it can start to dissolve our limiting sense of self. And because we have the experience that there is something that's emerged from within me that is richer than the ideas I've clung to about myself, it then allows us to soften our grip on the egoic sense of I'm this and I'm not that. Because I've had my own authentic, lived, visceral experience of, oh, there is something more than all that. So maybe I don't need to grip onto that short-termist, self-serving idea of I'm right and that's wrong, or this is good and that's bad. So as I practice giving myself to whatever I'm doing, I can train myself in getting out of my own way a little bit more. You gave me a challenge, Jules. I don't know if I've managed to distill things there. But so yoga is the practical means to fathom more of the mystery of who we really are, and then work with the gifts of a human birth skillfully so we can leave things better than we found them. And ultimately, if we do it well, crown this gift of a human birth by dying in peace. Because we're going to die. How do I want to die? Well, I'd like to die feeling ready, feeling fulfilled, feeling satisfied. How am I going to do that? Yoga's very pragmatic. Everything is training. Everything is practice. So if I want to die in peace, I better start training. I better start practicing sleeping in peace at the end of every day. And how am I going to do that? I'm going to increase my chance of doing that exponentially if I apprentice myself to the gifts of conscience. As a human being, I have this internal pilot. I have this inner guidance system. If I live my life as the expression of what in the Sanskrit language, the ancient language of yoga, let's say, is called dharma. Dharma means the action that supports the well-being of the individual and the whole. It's a beautiful word. As a noun, it means the essential quality of a thing. As a verb, the verbal root means to support, to sustain. So dharmic action means the action that supports the authentic wellness of the whole. So when I live my life as that dharmic expression, hopefully then I can sleep in peace more readily each day and bring an influence of peacefulness out into the world more readily. And yoga techniques are the means to help us do that. And the basic technique is observation. When I invite all my different conscious powers to come together, I'm going to see more than I might have seen before, including all sorts of things that I might prefer not to see.
That's exactly what I was just going to say, James, is that so many people are avoidant. What you describe as the outcome, I think that many people are looking for. Yeah. They want that peace. They want that unity. They want that. But I think that many people are, and I include myself for a great deal of my life. What do you mean? I've got to see the crappy stuff too. No, thanks very much. I don't want to look there. Just show me the shortcuts to the nice stuff. Yeah. Which is, I think, where I'm going to say Westerners, but I think it's more broader than that now. But I think that's very often where we end up getting hooked on a shortcut. Yes. A quick fix, short-term gratification. Let me go and do a few asanas and I feel good for half an hour afterwards. That's really cool. But don't say anything. I go home and my family's there. Don't say anything to disturb me because I've been to yoga and I'm all chill, thanks. Rather than actually bringing the practice. And anybody who knows you knows that this isn't something that you teach. This is something that you live and happen to teach along the way. But I think, it's very obvious as somebody who's...
Anybody that knows you knows that it cut out.
Well, you can fill in your own blank on that part then, James. Anybody that knows you knows that this isn't something that you teach. It's something that you live and happen to teach along the way. And I think what the description that you gave, what I gained as an insight, which I've never really seen in that way before, so thank you, is the war in factions internally. I've always got that it's not about solving the war outside. It's about the peace inside, what's going on inside, what's creating, and how is that turmoil, suffering being created internally. Yeah. What I loved about your description was that unification, that alignment isn't then about I'm having a negative quote unquote thought, right or wrong. It's just, there's that thought. That's to me what I'm hearing you describing. And the is coalescence the right word? Of the senses, coming to your senses. To me, there are more than 5. I've heard it been described brilliantly as 7. And I think that that's true. And bringing all of those things in and experiencing, because I don't think there's an allowance in it, but I think there is an experiencing that we're so absorbed by this external world. Yes. That even just asking somebody, how are you doing? Most people will just automatically give a stock answer rather than checking. Yeah.
And so that, that observation as we practice observing, we're going to see tremendous beauty, subtlety that we didn't see before. We're also going to see all sorts of things that we would prefer not to have to look at. But the reason yoga works is because it gives us an experience of a robust steadiness that then primes us to take on the next challenge. So it'll give us the experience of wholeness, and then it'll bring into our awareness the next tendency that we've been harboring that would get in the way of the sustained experience of that wellness. So if we want peace, I want to have peace. So if I pray for peace, when I say pray, I mean if I do my best to practice peace, to invite peace, to embody peace, then what am I asking for? In a sense, I'm asking for trouble, because I'm asking to bring into keener awareness those very habits, tendencies that I have been harboring that would get in the way of sustained peacefulness. Mm-hmm. But what happens? I do invite peace by bringing all the powers of my awareness into tune, into rhythm, into harmony. And I feel, and this feel, it doesn't feel strange. It feels like home. Yes. So I know that this capacity is within me. And then I see my own delusion, or I see, oh man, that's not a helpful habit. That's not good for me or the people around me. Oh man, I've got to go over that stuff again. I've got to change that habit. Changing habits is hard work. But one of the things yoga invites us to experience is that it can be its own self-propelling reward. Once we go into the dark, go into the mud, go into the depths, and you use the example, Jules, of the internal conflict. So the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most treasured texts of the yoga tradition, is set on a battlefield. And there are many yoga teachings set on battlefields. It's not an accident. And as you suggest, there are these warring factions. There are these different tendencies within us that push and pull in different directions. So rather than resist, there's this dark side inside me, there's this shadowy bit, there's this bit that's been neglected and it's got all this, bitterness or resentment or whatever it might be. There's this sadness down there. Do I need to look at that? Whatever it might be. It's like, no, let's go into the dark, but let's go in calm. I'm not going to create peace by trying to rip to shreds my enemies. We see what happens when we take that attitude. It just creates more enmity. So the idea in yoga is, no, let's go and meet the seeming enemy from a steady place. Because maybe that internal enemy has a lesson for me. And if I give it my attention, if I can observe, just like you said, I can observe. It's like, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. Oh, it's this. This doesn't feel very helpful. What's underneath it? And so one of the main things that yoga invites us to deepen our understanding of is our own capacity to stay steady amidst the inevitable whirlings and ups and downs of life. Because life's going to be change. That's inevitable. So the teachings of yoga say, life's always going to be throwing all sorts of unexpected things at us. We've no control over that. But we have agency over how we meet life, how we respond to it. And so everything in life, it has essential qualities. It exists, it's dynamic, it's changing. But even though everything in life is changing, things have inertia. There is a force of habit. So the habit yoga asks us to develop is the habit of examining our habits and inviting our habits to become more and more cohesive. So we train ourselves in the ways of actually working with the forces of change. Because when we recognize, I have a habit that isn't serving me, but it's lived in this field for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 years, whatever it might be, is that habit, once I've identified it's no longer very helpful, is that habit going to say, oh, well, thanks for having me all these years, I'll be off now? No, it's clinging on for life. So what we need to do is give the whole system the experience that when I leave that habit behind, it's not that I'm killing myself, I'm dissolving some part of myself that isn't really helpful so it can then re-emerge in a more supportive way. But until we've had
So sorry to interrupt you there, James, but I think with what you're saying, it's a perfect opportunity to lead into the last question, because actually I suspect that that's where you're heading toward. I could be wrong, but I'm guessing, because what I love about these conversations is being able to leave people with a way to navigate that life's chaos and what best practice is. So what for you are the practices, and I think it everyday life chaos. You and I both know that we both individually, personally experience quite significant amounts of that, no matter how much work we're currently doing.
Sure.
And I think trying to avoid it, as you were just saying, is quite frankly dumb, because it's there. That's what happens.
Yeah.
So what habits or practices do you rely on to navigate life's chaos, to help you raise that awareness and maintain a level of calm and or clarity?
Okay. Well, so I'm 46 at the moment.
God, you're getting old.
Yeah. And so I've had a practice, a daily practice, since I was an early teenager. And that was one of the gifts of sport. Like my first basketball coach when I was 13 she basically taught me to have a daily practice. It wasn't laid out like that. She gave me training regimes for practicing skills and practicing conditioning. And I was really keen and I did it. But it meant that when I got introduced to yoga in my early 20s, it wasn't like a big thing to start doing techniques for significant time every day. So I've been very fortunate. For me, it's been tremendously helpful to develop this toolkit. But the thing that for me, what's special about yoga in its broader sense, the type of yoga I try to share, is it addresses the whole human being. So for me, I'm a person, I like to move. I've always liked to move. So I have a movement practice. That could be yogasana. Like this morning, I did some yogasana, but I'll probably do some further movement later today. So I have movement practices, and for me, they are really, really helpful. And yogasana is an amazing tool because it helps us work with energy. It's a very inside out practice. It's not about the external form, despite what sometimes it looks like in the way it's presented in the world today. It's all about how I'm inviting energy to circulate through my being, helping me feel grounded when I need to feel more grounded, helping elevate my energy when I need more energy elevation, helping me feel calmer. So once I learn about the techniques of yogasana, I can use them to help me be more balanced in the reality I'm working through now. If I've only got a little bit of time, what can I do? I can do these types of practices. I've only got 5 minutes. Well, I'll do this. I've got a whole hour. I'll do that. Today, I've got as much time as I like. I can do that. But I've had a meditation practice since my early 20s. And that's, I know many meditators have the same ideas. I just don't know how people navigate reality without it, because it just allows me to connect to something beyond all the noise and tune in. So I liken the idea to an orchestra. Yoga recognizes we have all these instrumental powers, our movement capacities, our sense capacities, our intelligences, all the rest of it. They're amazingly powerful things. But imagine a wonderful orchestra and all the players are tremendously capable. But if they don't first tune their instruments and tune in together, then even if they're all the best virtuosos, they're going to make a cacophonous racket. But if they just take that little bit of time to tune in, then they can play a beautiful movement. So for me, that's what yoga practice is. I have to take care of all the instruments. So this includes my physical body. The body requires maintenance. Now for me, as well as sleeping and eating real food, and this, for me, it requires certain types of movement. That I enjoy it, but that's part of my daily practice. So meditation, the opportunity to draw away from the external busyness and to dive deeper than the surface business of my mental chatter and connect to that part of myself that is connected to that which never dies. That's the most foundational practice. But I also, as part of my, let's say, weekly practice, I like to sing. I just did a kirtan yesterday evening in Malton, not so far from here. It was so nice. Singing it cleanses the parts that other practices don't reach. I not that long ago, only a few generations back, most people all around the world would sing with others most days. We would sing the blues, we would sing laments, we would sing songs of exaltation, gratitude, and celebration. We would sing songs telling stories that remind us of the basic foundation teachings of how to be a human and expressing the difficulties we encounter as human beings. It's so cleansing, cathartic, and singing songs of devotion. And in the Sanskrit language, it can really help recalibrate the nervous system very nicely. So that's something I did have a Sanskrit recitation practice as well. So I do a lot of techniques. And sometimes when people say, well, I can't possibly do that. So, no, this is what I dedicated my life to. But you could do a movement practice every day for 15 minutes every day, and then 2 or 3 times a week, an hour. This is realistic. You could meditate 20 minutes twice a day. You could. Because what most meditators experience, once you start meditating, the day gets more spacious. So if you do have the discipline to take that time, 10, 20 minutes regularly, twice a day, you realize, there's more space. So
it's the story of the businessman who goes to see the Zen master and says, I've learnt meditation. I'm so busy, I can't find the time. I know you said to meditate for 20 minutes a day. I can't find the time. What do you recommend? And the master says, meditate for 2 hours.
Yes.
and I think it's so true. I've got that experience myself, that the more easeful life becomes from an internal perspective, the more spacious it is externally.
Yeah.
I can't believe how much I've got done over the weekend, but unlike where I will have had a list and a strategy and all of that kind of stuff, rather than going with the genuine pull of whatever was next.
Yeah.
And even enjoying things like cleaning out the shed, because it wasn't I must be doing this now. It was that's genuinely what I want to be doing right now, because I am a weirdo.
Well, but I say as well, Jules, that to be able to transform the drudgery into practice, this is one of the key things. So, what I just said, the initial part of my answer to your question, I've still got a couple things I would like to say, but it can sound like a lot, but there's all of those techniques are just intended to train us for the rest of the day. So life will involve certain things that feel like drudgery or things that just have to be done. Now, what I would say is practice I have to be pragmatic about it. I have to be honest about it. So for me, looking after my physical bodily vehicle, it means I have to include exercise in my day-to-day life to be well. I have to take care of what I put into my body, food and drink-wise, if I want to feel well. The reality of the body is that it requires maintenance. I can pretend and I can try and hack my way through life. There are no hacks in yoga. There is tremendous reward for, like they say, discipline and freedom. Discipline brings freedom. If I look after things well, I've got more space to enjoy life. So I think the practice, we need to be honest with ourselves and take the time to get to know ourselves. This is why having a particular discipline of a meditation practice or an asana practice over some years, for example, don't think of it as like, I'm going to do this and in 10 weeks I'm going to be able to do that. No, think about it like over the next 7 years, I can get to know myself more. And if I work at that steadily, I'll enjoy life more and I'll be able to give more to the people around me. But I would say that we want to make sure the practice is addressing our physical humanity, our mental, intellectual, sensory, sensual, emotional reality. It's got to take care of the whole human being, including those parts of ourselves we often leave out. So meditation practice invites everything to just kind of settle together. But then having practices, like I mentioned, singing, that's more sensory, sensual, emotional. Movement practice is more kinesthetic. I also like to have satsang. I like to study texts and study stories and share stories together. It's part of my weekly practice. So it's more intellectual. It's also more linguistic. But this linguistic realm is part of what it means to be a human. Language is part of what shapes our reality. So having practices that address all these different facets of life is really, really helpful. But we have to do it in a way that is nourishing. And we have to do it in a way that the only thing that will really sustain practices that we love. So as we practice, the practice is going to show us things about ourselves that are not so easy to digest. So the practice has to be nourishing, and then it's going to give us the strength, the courage, the drive to move through those challenging times. There was one other thing that I wanted to say in response to the question about it slipped my mind now.
I think there's so much richness in what you've said, and I think the thing for me that stands out that I want to amplify is the word that you've used numerous times, which is movement, as opposed to the word exercise. And that's been a transformational moment to me, because opposed to complete opposite ends of the spectrum, I would have been the person at the side of the court cheering on the school team. I would not have been on the court, regardless of what the sport was. I hit a point where it was just too much from a physiological perspective to be seen in that way. And from a psychological perspective, the self-judgment that I had, there was no way that I wanted to put myself in that realm. That was just too much for me. So the word exercise and even sport and being sporty kind of became dirty words. And it took me, I think it was about 10, 15 years ago when I switched from talking about exercise to movement and invited the question of, what movement do I like? What lights me up? What do I want to do? And re-engage with things like dancing and 5 rhythms. I do go to the gym, but I don't go to the gym to pound the weights. I will literally walk into the gym and I will look and go, where do you want to go today then, buddy? And go on and there's some machines that I go on that I just go on for a few minutes because they make me laugh. Yeah. And I enjoy the way that my body moves on them. So, and I'm sure that there are many people that look at me kind of going, she's enjoying this? This is weird. But I'm just laughing my head off because it's just silliness. And I think that whether it is you're taking the depths of yoga, whether it is that you are going onto the courts or the pitch or whatever, I think that what's so important and what to me really comes out of so much of what you share and teach is about that wholeness of you and getting to know what ignites you to get high, whether that be through singing, whether that be through playing an instrument, whether that being in the garden, whatever it is, find your way in. And when you find your way in, make that your practice, bring that to your everyday, rather than seeing it has to always be something that goes to a mat or goes to a class.
Yes.
So I cannot thank you enough, James. I'm pretty sure that you and I could probably keep asking questions and going deeper and deeper for another, 3-4 hours maybe. So where we will put James's details in the show notes so that people can reach out and connect with you. James is I'm going to call you a digital nomad, in that you work all over the world in different ways, different countries, sharing what you've learned over the years, sharing singing, sharing movement, sharing the teachings, and so much more. I'm grateful to know you and have you in my life as a friend, as well as a teacher. So thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to catching up with you again at another point.
Thank you so much.